Montana Territory, 1876. Jane Jessup stood at the small window of the stagecoach, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse of prairie that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The rumbling wheels beneath her had carried her over 1,000 miles from Philadelphia, each rotation taking her further from the life she once knew and closer to an uncertain future. She clutched the small leather-bound journal in her hands, the only possession besides the clothes on her back and the meager coins that jingled in her pockets. Hope was her true currency now, worth more than the few dollars she had managed to save before fleeing east. "Whitehorn coming up, folks," the driver called down. "Last stop before Elk Valley." Jane took a deep breath. Whitehorn was just a waypoint. Elk Valley was her destination, a place she had selected from a newspaper advertisement seeking teachers for a frontier school. She had written ahead, but with no guarantee of the position, she was gambling everything on a possibility. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of a dusty general store. Jane stepped down carefully, mindful of her only pair of boots, sensible but showing signs of wear. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as she approached the station agent. "When does the coach to Elk Valley depart?" she asked, already knowing the answer would drain what little funds she had left. The agent scratched his beard. "No coach to Elk Valley, miss. That's another 30 miles northwest. Sometimes Mr. Reeves from the Double C Ranch brings supplies in. Might take passengers back if you're lucky." Jane felt the weight of disappointment settle in her stomach. When might he arrive? Hard to say. Maybe today, maybe next week. The agent shrugged with the indifference of a man accustomed to the unpredictable rhythms of frontier life. Jane nodded and retreated to a wooden bench outside the station. She opened her journal, where she had carefully mapped out her journey and the small amount of money remaining. After the stagecoach fare, she had exactly $2.17 to her name. Not enough for a room at the local boarding house for more than a night, certainly not enough to hire a private conveyance to Elk Valley. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the single dirt street of Whitehorn, Jane observed the comings and goings of the small settlement. Women in practical calico dresses moved purposefully between errands. Men in dusty work clothes gathered at the saloon, and children played in the spaces between buildings. This world was as foreign to her as Paris or Rome would have been. The sound of approaching hooves and the creak of wagon wheels drew her attention. A large freight wagon pulled by 4 sturdy horses rolled into town, the driver a broad-shouldered man whose face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He pulled the team to a halt in front of the general store and jumped down with the easy grace of someone who had performed the action thousands of times. "Mr. Reeves," the store owner called out, emerging from his establishment. "Right on time for once." The man, Mr. Reeves, laughed, a rich sound that carried across the street. "Don't get used to it, Harold. River's running high after that rain last week." Jane watched as he began unloading crates and barrels from the wagon. His movements were efficient, powerful. She gathered her courage and approached. "Excuse me," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "Are you from Elk Valley?" The man turned, and Jane found herself looking up into the most startlingly blue eyes she had ever seen. They crinkled slightly at the corners as he studied her. "That I am, miss. Colton Reeves, Double C Ranch." He removed his hat, revealing thick chestnut hair in need of a trim. "What can I do for you?" "I'm Jane Jessup. I've come to take the teaching position in Elk Valley," she said, then hesitated. "At least, I hope to. I wrote to the school board last month, but I haven't received confirmation." Colton Reeves tilted his head slightly. "You're the teacher from back east? Folks have been wondering if you'd actually show up. Most don't make it this far." Hope flared in Jane's chest. "Then the position is still open?" "Far as I know. Town's been without a proper teacher since Miss Winters left to get married last fall." He glanced at her single carpet bag. "Is this all your belongings?" Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Yes. I traveled light." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, she noted with relief, but perhaps understanding. "I'll be heading back once I finish my business here," he said. "You're welcome to ride along if you don't mind a freight wagon instead of a stagecoach." "That would be most appreciated, Mr. Reeves." Jane struggled to keep the desperate relief from her voice. "I'll be about an hour. You might want to get something to eat at the hotel dining room before we leave. It's a long, rough ride to Elk Valley." Jane nodded, though the suggestion presented a problem. Her remaining funds needed to last until she received her first wages, assuming she secured the teaching position. Thank you. I'll be ready when you are. As Colton returned to his work, Jane retreated to her bench, calculating whether she could afford even the most modest meal. The hunger gnawing at her stomach argued with her practical mind. She had eaten nothing since a small piece of bread at dawn, having rationed her food carefully during the journey. An hour later, Jane watched as Colton loaded the last of his purchases onto the wagon. She approached, carpetbag in hand, hoping her hunger wasn't evident. Colton helped her up onto the high seat, then climbed up beside her. "Ready for some rough country, Miss Jessup?" "I believe I am, Mr. Reeves," she replied, though in truth, she had no idea what to expect. Philadelphia's cobblestone streets had not prepared her for frontier travel. As they pulled away from Whitehorn, Jane couldn't help but wonder what awaited her in Elk Valley. Would the town welcome her? Would she find a place to belong? And what of this man beside her, whose ranch apparently held enough importance to give it the first letter of its name? "So what brings a woman from the east all the way out here?" Colton asked as they left the last buildings of Whitehorn behind. "Most folks come with family or husbands." Jane considered her answer carefully. "I came for an opportunity to build something of my own." She didn't mention the scandal that had driven her from Philadelphia, the broken engagement that had left her reputation in tatters. Some truths were better left behind, like the city itself. "And there's nothing like that back east?" Colton asked, his tone curious rather than judgmental. "Not for me. Not anymore." Jane gazed at the rolling grasslands stretching to distant mountains. "Sometimes a person needs a fresh start." Colton nodded, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Well, you've certainly come to the right place for that. Out here, folks don't much care where you came from, only what you can contribute." As the wagon rumbled onward, Jane's stomach gave an audible growl. She placed a hand over it, embarrassed, but Colton had already heard. Without comment, he reached beneath the seat and pulled out a cloth-wrapped package. "Harold's wife makes the best biscuits in the territory. She always sends some along when I make the supply run." He opened the package to reveal several large biscuits and slices of ham. "Help yourself." Pride warred with hunger for a moment before Jane accepted a biscuit and a slice of ham. "Thank you. Been a long journey, I expect," Colton said casually, not looking at her as she ate. It was a kindness, she realized, allowing her to maintain her dignity. "Very long," she agreed between careful bites. "For weeks, with various delays." The conversation flowed more easily after that, as Colton pointed out landmarks and Jane asked questions about Elk Valley and its residents. She learned that the town was small but growing, with a population just over 300. There was a general store, a hotel, 2 saloons, a small church, and the schoolhouse where she hoped to teach. "And your ranch?" Jane asked. "The Double C?" A smile touched Colton's lips, warm with pride. "Started with just 40 acres and 12 head of cattle when my father claimed it 15 years ago. Now we run over 5,000 head on 20,000 acres. Jane's eyes widened. "That's substantial." Colton chuckled. "Pa would say it's still not enough. Ranching gets in your blood. Always looking to the next ridge, the next valley. Your father must be very proud of what you've built together." A shadow crossed Colton's face. "He passed 3 years ago. Pneumonia. It's just me running things now, with a good foreman and about 20 hands." "I'm sorry for your loss," Jane said softly. "Thank you." Colton cleared his throat. "What about your family? Do they know you've gone so far west?" Jane hesitated. "My parents passed when I was 16. My aunt raised me after that. But she didn't approve of my decision to come west." What Jane didn't say was that her aunt had all but disowned her after the broken engagement, calling her ruined and ungrateful. The teaching position wasn't just an opportunity, it was her only viable option. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain became more varied, with rolling hills and scattered pine groves. The trail narrowed and grew rockier, the wagon jolting over ruts and stones. Jane gripped the seat with white knuckles during particularly rough stretches. "First time in a freight wagon?" Colton asked, amusement in his voice. "Is it that obvious?" Jane managed to smile despite her discomfort. "You're doing better than most city folk. Had a banker from Chicago once who demanded I stop every mile so he could walk alongside to preserve his spine." Jane laughed, the sound surprising her. When had she last truly laughed? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Colton pointed ahead. "There it is, Elk Valley." Jane leaned forward eagerly. The town was smaller than she had imagined, nestled in a broad valley with a silver ribbon of river curving along its eastern edge. The buildings were predominantly wooden, with a few brick structures marking what she assumed were more prosperous businesses. "It's lovely," she said honestly, taken by the dramatic backdrop of mountains and the orderly arrangement of the town. "Wait until you see it in spring when the wildflowers carpet the valley," Colton said. "Even the most hardened cowboys admit it's a sight to behold." As they approached the outskirts of town, Jane became aware of her appearance. Travel-worn, dusty, certainly not the image of a composed schoolteacher she had hoped to present. She smoothed her skirts and tucked stray hairs back into her simple bun. "The school board chairman is Samuel Wilson. He owns the general store," Colton informed her. "He'll be the one to speak with about the position." Jane nodded, anxiety churning in her stomach. "And is there a boarding house where I might stay?" "Mrs. Holloway runs a respectable place for single ladies," Colton replied. $3 a week with meals." $3. Jane did some quick calculations. Even if she secured the teaching position immediately, her first wages wouldn't come for at least 2 weeks. Her remaining $2.17 wouldn't cover even 1 week's board. Colton seemed to read her expression. "Most folks will extend credit to the schoolteacher. It's considered an important position here." "I don't like to begin with debts," Jane said quietly. The wagon rolled down the main street, drawing curious glances from townspeople. Jane felt their eyes on her, assessing, wondering. She sat straighter, determined to project confidence despite her circumstances. Colton pulled the team to a halt in front of a 2-story building with Wilson's General Merchandise painted above the door. "Here we are. Would you like me to introduce you to Samuel?" "Please," Jane said, grateful for the offer. Inside the store, a bespectacled man with thinning gray hair was helping a customer with fabric. He looked up as they entered, his eyebrows rising at the sight of Jane. "Samuel," Colton called. "Got something more valuable than supplies today? This is Miss Jane Jessup, come all the way from Philadelphia for the teaching position." Samuel Wilson approached, studying Jane with open curiosity. "Miss Jessup, we received your letter but weren't certain you'd actually arrive. Many find the journey too daunting." "I'm not easily deterred, Mr. Wilson," Jane replied, extending her hand. "I understand the position is still available?" "It is indeed. The children have been making do with rotating parent teachers, but we sorely need someone properly trained." He shook her hand firmly. "When can you start?" The directness of the question caught Jane off guard. As soon as tomorrow, if that's acceptable. I would need to review the curriculum and supplies first." "Excellent." Samuel beamed. "The position pays $30 a month, with the schoolhouse available for your residence if you prefer it to boarding." Jane felt a wave of relief wash over her. The schoolhouse. She wouldn't need to spend precious funds on boarding after all. The schoolhouse would be perfect, she said, perhaps too quickly. Samuel and Colton exchanged a glance that Jane couldn't quite interpret. "It's rather rustic," Samuel cautioned. "Just a small room at the back. Previous teachers usually preferred Mrs. Holloway's boarding house." "I'm sure it will suit me fine," Jane insisted. "I prefer to be close to my work." Samuel nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll have my wife bring over some basic provisions to get you settled. The school board will meet tomorrow evening to formally approve your appointment, but that's just a formality at this point." "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'm eager to begin." As they left the store, Colton offered to drive Jane to the schoolhouse. The small wooden building sat at the edge of town, painted white with a small bell tower. It looked charming from the outside, with wildflowers growing along the path to the front steps. Inside was a single large room with rows of benches and desks facing a blackboard. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner, and bookshelves lined the back wall. The teacher's quarters, as Samuel had described, was indeed just a small room behind the classroom, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a clothes press. Jane stood in the center of the sparse room, acutely aware of Colton watching her reaction from the doorway. She forced a smile. "It's perfect." "It's not much," he said frankly. "It's more than I had yesterday," she replied with equal frankness. Colton seemed to consider her words. "I'll bring in your bag and some firewood. Nights get cold here, even in summer." As he went to retrieve her things, Jane sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the exhaustion that had dogged her for weeks. She had made it. Against all odds, she had secured a position and a roof over her head. It wasn't much, as Colton had said, but it was a beginning. When he returned with her carpet bag and an armload of firewood, Jane had composed herself again. "I want to thank you, Mr. Reeves," she said as he built a fire in the small stove. "Your kindness today has meant more than I can express." Colton straightened, brushing his hands on his pants. "Just being neighborly, Miss Jessup. That's how we survive out here, looking out for one another. Nevertheless, I'm grateful." He nodded, suddenly seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Mrs. Wilson will be by shortly with some supplies. If you need anything else, the ranch is just 4 miles north of town." He hesitated. "Elk Valley can be a good place, Miss Jessup. Hope you find what you're looking for here." With that, he departed, leaving Jane alone in her new home. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the crackle of the fire and the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town settling into evening. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, things might turn out all right. What she couldn't know was how deeply her arrival had already affected Colton Reeves, or how their paths would continue to cross in the days and weeks to come. She couldn't know that the rich rancher who had given her a ride into town would soon offer her so much more than she ever dared hope for. Jane was awakened at dawn by the sound of children's voices outside the schoolhouse. She hurried to dress in her one good teaching outfit, a navy skirt and white shirtwaist, and pinned her hair neatly. The provisions Mrs. Wilson had delivered the previous evening included coffee, which Jane gratefully brewed on the small stove. When she opened the schoolhouse door, she found 5 children of varying ages standing in the yard, staring at her with undisguised curiosity. "Good morning," she greeted them, smiling. "I'm Miss Jessup, your new teacher. Are you really from Philadelphia?" A freckle-faced boy of about 10 asked without preamble. "I am indeed," Jane replied. "Pa says people from the East are too soft for Montana," the boy continued, his expression challenging. Jane raised an eyebrow. "And who might your father be?" "Frank Miller. He runs the livery." "Well, Master Miller, please inform your father that this Easterner intends to prove him wrong." She gestured toward the schoolhouse door. "Now, shall we begin our day of learning?" By noon, Jane had assessed the abilities of her 12 students, ranging in age from 6 to 15. Some were surprisingly advanced in arithmetic, while others could barely read. The previous teacher had maintained meticulous records, however, giving Jane a clear understanding of where each child stood academically. As the children ate their midday meals from packed tins, Jane heard the sound of a wagon approaching. She stepped outside to see Colton Reeves pulling up in a smaller wagon than he'd driven the previous day. Beside him sat a woman with silver-streaked dark hair, dressed in a practical brown dress. "Miss Jessup," Colton called, jumping down. "I've brought someone who wanted to meet you. This is Mrs. Elena Diaz, my housekeeper and the best cook in the territory." The woman approached with a warm smile. "Mr. Colton exaggerates, but I did want to welcome you properly." She held out a covered basket. "Some bread and stew for your supper, and eggs and bacon for your breakfast tomorrow." Jane was momentarily speechless at the gesture. "That's extraordinarily kind, Mrs. Diaz." "Thank you." "It is nothing," Elena dismissed with a wave. "Teaching children is hard work. You must eat well." The children had gathered at the schoolhouse door, watching the exchange with interest. "Mr. Reeves," several called out, clearly familiar with him. Colton tipped his hat to them. "Behaving yourselves for Miss Jessup, I hope?" "Yes, sir," they chorused, though Jane noted the Miller boy looked somewhat chastened. "Good, because she's come a long way to teach you, and I don't want to hear you're giving her any trouble." Though his tone was light, there was an undercurrent of seriousness that the children clearly recognized. As Elena chatted with the children, asking about their families, Colton moved closer to Jane. "How are you finding the accommodations?" he asked quietly. "Perfectly adequate," Jane assured him, though in truth, she had discovered several deficiencies: a leaking roof corner, mice droppings in the cupboard, and a draft that had kept her chilled despite the fire. Colton's expression suggested he didn't quite believe her. "The school board meets tonight. I'll mention a few repairs that might be needed." Before Jane could protest, Elena rejoined them. "I must get back to prepare dinner for the ranch hands," she said. "But I will visit again soon, Miss Jessup. Perhaps you will join us for Sunday dinner at the ranch this weekend?" Jane hesitated, caught off guard by the invitation. "That's very kind, but no arguments," Elena insisted. Mr. Colton will bring the wagon for you after church." With that settled, Elena and Colton departed, leaving Jane holding the basket of food and feeling strangely off balance. The children were watching her with renewed interest. "Is Mr. Reeves courting you, Miss Jessup?" asked Mary Wilson, Samuel's 12-year-old daughter. "Certainly not," Jane replied, perhaps too quickly. "Mr. Reeves is simply being neighborly, as is Mrs. Diaz. Pa says Mr. Reeves needs a wife," volunteered another child. "Says the double C is too big for just one man." Jane clapped her hands. "That's quite enough discussion of Mr. Reeves's personal affairs. Back to your studies, children." As the afternoon progressed, Jane found herself occasionally distracted by thoughts of Colton Reeves. He was undeniably handsome, and his kindness seemed genuine rather than obligatory. But Jane had learned the hard way back in Philadelphia that a man's attentions often came with expectations she wasn't willing to meet. She had come west to establish herself as an independent woman, not to find a husband. That evening, as Jane ate the delicious stew Elena had sent, there was a knock at her door. Samuel Wilson stood there, along with an older woman in a severe black dress. "Miss Jessup, the school board has met and officially confirmed your appointment," Samuel announced. "This is Mrs. Holloway, another board member." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Holloway," Jane said, inviting them in. Mrs. Holloway surveyed the small room with a critical eye. "This will never do," she declared. "A young woman of your standing should be at my boarding house, not living like a hermit behind the schoolhouse." "I assure you, I'm quite comfortable here," Jane began, but Mrs. Holloway continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Mr. Reeves has arranged to cover your board at my establishment for the first month, until you receive your wages," she stated. "Most generous of him, though not unexpected. He's always had a soft spot for the schoolteachers." Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from embarrassment at needing charity, partly from the implication that she was just the latest in a line of teachers to receive Colton's attention. "That's unnecessary. I prefer to remain here." Samuel cleared his throat. "Actually, Miss Jessup, the board has decided some repairs are needed to the teachers' quarters. The roof leaks, the window frames need recaulking, and apparently there's a family of mice that needs evicting." Jane's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Reeves mentioned the repairs, didn't he?" Samuel had the grace to look sheepish. "He may have brought a few issues to our attention, yes. But he's right. These quarters aren't suitable in their current state. It would be best if you stayed at Mrs. Holloway's while the work is done." Trapped by both logic and circumstance, Jane could only nod her agreement. "Very well. When should I move my things?" "First thing tomorrow," Mrs. Holloway said briskly. "I'll have a room ready for you. The finest one, as befits the town's teacher." After they left, Jane sat at her small table, conflicted emotions warring within her. On one hand, she was touched by Colton's concern and generosity. On the other, she was wary of becoming indebted to him, both financially and emotionally. In Philadelphia, her fiancé had used his financial support to control her, to demand things she wasn't willing to give. When she refused, he had broken their engagement and spread rumors that ruined her reputation. Jane couldn't allow herself to become dependent on a man again, no matter how kind he seemed. She would accept the boarding house arrangement temporarily, but would insist on repaying Colton for his generosity as soon as she received her wages. The following morning, Jane moved her meager belongings to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, a tidy two-story building with a wide porch and lace curtains in the windows. Her room was indeed lovely, spacious, with a proper bed, a writing desk, and a rocking chair near the window that overlooked the town's main street. "Mr. Reeves said you were to have our best room," Mrs. Holloway informed her as she showed Jane around. "Though I would have given it to you anyway. The schoolteacher holds an important position in our community." "It's very kind, but I must insist on repaying Mr. Reeves," Jane said firmly. Mrs. Holloway gave her an appraising look. "Pride is all well and good, Miss Jessup, but out here, accepting help when it's offered is simply practical. Mr. Reeves can certainly afford it. Nevertheless, I prefer to pay my own way." Later that day, as Jane was returning from the schoolhouse where she had been organizing books and supplies, she encountered Colton outside the general store. He was loading supplies into his wagon again, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. "Miss Jessup," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "Settled in at Mrs. Holloway's, I hope?" Jane approached him directly. Mr. Reeves, while I appreciate your generosity, I cannot accept your charity. I will repay you for the boarding house as soon as I receive my wages. Colton leaned against his wagon, studying her with those intense blue eyes. It's not charity, Miss Jessup. Consider it an investment in our children's education. A teacher who's not worrying about shelter can focus better on teaching. Nevertheless, I insist on repaying you. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. You're a stubborn woman, aren't you? I prefer determined, Jane replied, unable to suppress an answering smile. All right, determined then. Colton straightened. How about a compromise? You can repay me by joining Elena and me for Sunday dinner, as she invited you to do. She's been cooking since dawn, planning a feast fit for the governor. Jane hesitated. A dinner invitation seemed innocent enough, and she was genuinely fond of Elena after their brief meeting. That seems an uneven exchange. Not to me, Colton said simply. Something in his direct gaze made Jane's heart beat a little faster. Very well, dinner on Sunday, but I will still repay the boarding house fees. Colton laughed. I've never met a more determined negotiator. We'll discuss it further on Sunday. As Jane continued to her boarding house, she was uncomfortably aware that despite her best intentions, Colton Reeves was becoming increasingly difficult to keep at arm's length. It wasn't just his handsome face or his generosity. It was the way he looked at her, as if he truly saw her, not just as the new schoolteacher or a woman in need of assistance, but as Jane herself. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous thing of all. Because Jane had come to Montana territory with nothing but hope in her pockets and a determination to build a new life on her own terms. Allowing herself to be drawn to Colton Reeves could complicate everything she had worked so hard to achieve. What Jane didn't realize was that across town, Colton was having similar thoughts as he finished loading his wagon. The schoolteacher from Philadelphia with her proper speech and determined chin had gotten under his skin in a way no woman ever had before. And for a man who had built his empire through careful planning and calculated risks, the feelings Jane Jessup stirred in him were territory more unpredictable than any frontier he had ever faced. Sunday arrived clear and crisp, with the first hints of autumn coloring the aspens on the surrounding hillsides. Jane dressed in her finest outfit, a forest green skirt and cream-colored shirtwaist with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It was one of the few quality pieces she had kept from her former life, a reminder of who she had been before scandal forced her west. Mrs. Holloway observed Jane's careful preparations with knowing eyes. Mr. Reeves is quite the catch, she remarked as Jane pinned her hair. Half the unmarried women in the county have set their caps for him, but he's never shown particular interest in any of them. I'm not setting my cap for anyone, Jane replied firmly. I'm simply accepting a dinner invitation. Mrs. Holloway smiled. Of course, dear. Though a woman in your position would be wise to consider her future. Teaching is all well and good for a young lady, but eventually. I have no plans to marry, Mrs. Holloway. Jane interrupted, more sharply than she intended. She softened her tone. My focus is on establishing myself professionally. The older woman raised her eyebrows, but said nothing more. Colton arrived precisely at noon, driving a polished buggy rather than his usual wagon. He had traded his work clothes for a clean shirt, vest, and string tie, his hair neatly combed beneath his hat. Jane felt a flutter in her stomach that she firmly attributed to hunger rather than the sight of him. Miss Jessup, he greeted her, stepping down to help her into the buggy. You look lovely today. Thank you, she replied, accepting his hand and trying to ignore the warmth that spread through her at his touch. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Reeves. He laughed as he climbed up beside her. Elena insisted. Said I couldn't bring our guest of honor home looking like I'd just wrestled a steer. As they drove north out of town, Jane was struck by the beauty of the landscape. Rolling grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, the colors more vibrant than any painting she had seen in Philadelphia's finest galleries. It's breathtaking, she said softly. Never gets old, Colton agreed, his eyes on the horizon. Even after living here most of my life, there are still mornings when I step outside and it just stops me in my tracks. How did your family come to settle here? Jane asked, genuinely curious about the man beside her. Colton was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. My father was a dreamer, always looking for the next big opportunity. We moved a lot when I was young, following one scheme after another. Then he read about the Montana Territory in a newspaper, about the open range and the future of cattle ranching. A smile touched his lips. For once, his dream was the right one. We arrived when I was 12, and he staked a claim on a small piece of land. Worked ourselves nearly to death those first few years, but it paid off. And your mother? Jane asked gently. Lost her when I was 8. Fever. His voice held old pain, well-worn but still present. Just my father and me after that, until we came here and met Elena and her husband, Miguel. They worked for us from the beginning, became family, really. Elena mentioned her husband in past tense when we spoke. Miguel passed 5 years ago. Heart gave out while he was mending fences. Colton's hands tightened slightly on the reins. Good man. Taught me most of what I know about cattle. Jane nodded, understanding the tapestry of loss and perseverance that had shaped him. And you've built quite an impressive operation from those humble beginnings. We've been fortunate, Colton acknowledged. Though in my experience, fortune favors those who work 18 hours a day. He glanced at her. What about you? What led a Philadelphia lady to become a teacher in the wilds of Montana? Jane hesitated, unsure how much of her story to share. I always wanted to teach, she began truthfully. Even as a child, I would gather the neighborhood children and conduct classes with my dolls and teddy bears as students. But why come all the way out here? Surely Philadelphia has schools. It does. Jane looked out at the passing landscape. But sometimes circumstances require a fresh beginning in a new place. Colton seemed to sense her reluctance to elaborate. Well, whatever those circumstances were, I'm glad they brought you to Elk Valley. The simple sincerity in his voice caught Jane off guard. Thank you, she said softly. They crested a small rise, and the Double C Ranch came into view. Jane gasped involuntarily. She had expected something substantial based on Colton's description, but the reality exceeded her imagination. A large, 2-story house of hewn logs and stone dominated the central compound, surrounded by numerous outbuildings, corrals, and barns. In the distance, cattle dotted the hillsides, and cowboys on horseback moved among them. Welcome to the Double C, Colton said, a note of pride in his voice. It's magnificent, Jane said honestly. As they approached the house, Elena appeared on the wide porch, wiping her hands on her apron. You are right on time, she called. The roast is just coming out of the oven. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior, spacious rooms with high ceilings, quality furniture that managed to be both elegant and practical, and large windows that framed the spectacular views. It was a perfect blend of frontier practicality and unexpected refinement. Your home is beautiful, Jane told Colton as he showed her to the dining room. Most of the credit goes to Elena, he replied. She's been after me for years to make it more civilized, as she puts it. Elena, who had followed them with a platter of roast beef, snorted. If I had left it to him, there would still be saddles in the parlor and maps spread across the dining table. The meal that followed was the finest Jane had eaten since leaving Philadelphia. Roast beef with gravy, potatoes, fresh vegetables from Elena's garden, and homemade bread still warm from the oven. The conversation flowed easily, with Elena sharing stories of Colton's younger days that made him groan with embarrassment and Jane laugh until her sides ached. After dessert, an apple pie that Elena proudly announced featured fruit from their own orchard, Colton suggested showing Jane around the property. You must see the new foals, Elena insisted. Mr. Colton's prize mare delivered twins last month. Very rare and very beautiful. As they walked toward the stables, Jane was struck by how natural it felt to be in Colton's company. Despite their different backgrounds, conversation never lagged, and she found herself sharing thoughts and observations she might normally keep to herself. The twin foals were indeed beautiful, leggy and curious, with matching white stars on their foreheads. As Jane leaned against the paddock fence watching them frolic, Colton moved to stand beside her, their shoulders almost touching. I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your boarding house, he said without preamble. And I have a proposition. Jane tensed slightly. Oh, the school board is responsible for the teacher's welfare. Rather than me personally covering your board, I'll propose at the next meeting that the board add a housing allowance to your salary, retroactive to your start date, of course. Jane considered this. That would be acceptable. Thank you. Colton nodded, seeming pleased with her response. Good. I thought you might appreciate that arrangement better. You were right. Jane turned to face him fully. You're very perceptive, Mr. Reeves. Colton, he corrected gently. After sharing Elena's apple pie, I think we can dispense with formalities, don't you? Jane smiled. Colton then, and you may call me Jane. Something shifted in the air between them, a subtle change that Jane couldn't quite name but felt acutely. Colton was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. A rider galloped into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat. Mr. Reeves, the man called urgently. Trouble at the north pasture. Rustlers hit during the night. Drove off about 50 head. Boys are tracking them now, but they're headed for the high country. Colton's expression hardened instantly. Saddle thunder, he instructed, then turned to Jane. I'm sorry, but I need to handle this. Of course, Jane said, understanding the seriousness of the situation. Cattle rustling was not just theft, it was a threat to his livelihood. Elena will see you back to town, Colton said, already striding toward the house. I'll come by when I return to let you know what happened. Within minutes, Colton had changed into riding clothes and was galloping away with the ranch hand, leaving Jane with a strange sense of loss. Elena patted her arm sympathetically. The first time is always unsettling, she said cryptically, seeing how quickly he must change from the gentleman to the rancher. Does this happen often? Jane asked. The rustling? Elena sighed. More often lately. There is a gang operating in these parts, very organized, very dangerous. They have already killed 2 ranchers who try to stop them. Her eyes followed Colton's disappearing figure. I worry each time he rides out. The revelation of this danger cast a shadow over the pleasant day. As Elena drove Jane back to town in the buggy, Jane found herself scanning the distant hills, as if she might catch a glimpse of Colton and his men pursuing the rustlers. He is a good man, Elena said quietly, seeming to read Jane's thoughts. The best I have known, besides my Miguel. But the ranch demands much from him. He seems very dedicated to it, Jane replied carefully. Elena glanced at her. Perhaps too dedicated. A man needs more than land and cattle to make a life worth living. She patted Jane's hand. But enough of an old woman's philosophizing. Tell me how you are finding your students. The change of subject was welcome, and Jane spent the remainder of the journey describing her pupils and her plans for their education. By the time they reached Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of orange and purple. Thank you for a lovely day, Jane said as she descended from the buggy. Please let me know when Colton returns safely. Elena's eyes twinkled. So it is Colton now, is it? Jane felt her cheeks warm. We agreed to dispense with formalities. Elena hummed knowingly. I will send word when he returns. And you must come to dinner again soon. As Jane prepared for bed that evening, her thoughts kept returning to Colton, his kindness, his quiet strength, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. And now, the knowledge that he was somewhere in the mountains, potentially facing dangerous men. She told herself her concern was merely that of a friend for another friend's welfare. But as she drifted off to sleep, Jane knew she was in danger of breaking her most important rule. Never again allow a man to become important enough to hurt her when he inevitably disappointed her. 3 days passed with no word from Colton or the Double C Ranch. Jane threw herself into her teaching duties, trying not to worry, but found herself scanning the street whenever she heard approaching horses. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Mary Wilson approached her desk after the other children had been dismissed. Pa says Mr. Reeves and his men caught the rustlers, she announced importantly. They're bringing them in today. Jane's relief was immediate and powerful. That's excellent news, Mary. Thank you for telling me. Pa says there was a gunfight, the girl continued, eyes wide. And Mr. Reeves was shot. Jane felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. Shot? Is he? She couldn't bring herself to finish the question. Pa says it's not too bad. Just his arm. Mary seemed almost disappointed by this lack of drama. They should be in town by supper time. It took all of Jane's self-control to maintain her composure until Mary left. Once alone, she sank into her chair, her hands trembling slightly. The intensity of her reaction shocked her. Colton Reeves had been part of her life for barely a week, yet the thought of him injured, or worse, affected her more deeply than she could have imagined. That evening, Jane found it impossible to concentrate on grading papers or planning lessons. She paced her room at the boarding house, periodically glancing out the window, toward the main street. Finally, unable to bear the confinement any longer, she went downstairs, intending to take a walk to clear her head. Mrs. Holloway intercepted her in the foyer. "They've just arrived," she informed Jane. "Mr. Reeves and his men, with the rustlers. They're taking the criminals to the jail now." "And Mr. Reeves?" Jane asked, trying to sound merely curious rather than desperate for information. "I heard he was injured. Shot in the arm, from what I understand. Dr. Farley is seeing to him at his office." Mrs. Holloway gave Jane a knowing look. "Just across the street and 2 doors down, should you wish to inquire about his condition personally." Jane hesitated only briefly before reaching for her shawl. "I think I will. As a friend, of course." "Of course," Mrs. Holloway echoed, not bothering to hide her smile. The doctor's office was well lit, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. Jane paused outside, suddenly uncertain. What if her concern was unwelcome? What if Colton misinterpreted her interest? Before she could decide whether to enter or retreat, the door opened, and Elena emerged. Her face brightened at the sight of Jane. "You have heard, then," she said, taking Jane's hands in hers. "Come, he is being stubborn as always, but perhaps you can talk sense into him." Before Jane could protest, Elena was leading her into the doctor's office and toward an examination room at the back. The door was ajar, and Jane could hear Colton's voice, low and irritated. "It's a scratch, document. I've had worse from breaking colts." "A bullet wound is never just a scratch, Mr. Reeves," came the doctor's patient reply. "And you've lost blood. You need rest." Elena knocked lightly, then pushed the door open wider. "Look who has come to see you." Colton was seated on an examination table, his shirt removed to allow the doctor to bandage his upper left arm. Despite the situation, Jane couldn't help noticing his broad chest and well-muscled shoulders, the result of years of physical labor. A deep flush rose in her cheeks, and she quickly raised her eyes to his face. Surprise, then pleasure, flickered across his features. "Jane, I heard what happened," she said, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a generous mustache, finished securing the bandage. "He'll live, though not for lack of trying to get himself killed. The bullet passed clean through the muscle. No bones hit, thankfully. See? Nothing serious," Colton insisted, reaching for his shirt. The doctor shook his head in exasperation. "Rest. Fluids. No riding for at least 3 days." He gathered his supplies. "I'll leave you to convince him, ladies. Perhaps he'll listen to you." As the doctor departed, Jane moved further into the room. Up close, she could see the lines of fatigue etched around Colton's eyes and the pallor beneath his tan. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. Colton laughed, then winced as the movement jostled his injured arm. "You sure know how to make a man feel better." Elena muttered something in Spanish that sounded distinctly like a complaint about stubborn men. "I am going to the hotel to arrange a room. You cannot ride back to the ranch tonight." "Elena," Colton began to protest. "No arguments," the housekeeper said firmly. "You will stay in town tonight, and we will see how you are tomorrow." She looked at Jane. "Perhaps you will make sure he does not try to leave?" Before either of them could respond, Elena swept from the room, closing the door behind her with a decisive click. Jane found herself alone with Colton, suddenly aware of his state of undress and their unusual privacy. "Do you need help with your shirt?" she asked practically, refusing to indulge her discomfort. "If you wouldn't mind," he admitted. "Seems my left arm isn't cooperating at the moment." Jane stepped forward and held the shirt open so he could slip his uninjured arm into the sleeve. Then, carefully, she eased the fabric over his bandaged arm, acutely conscious of his winces despite his attempts to hide them. "Did you at least recover your cattle?" she asked as she began fastening the buttons, keeping her eyes fixed on her task rather than his face. "Most of them. And we caught all 4 rustlers. They'll stand trial in Helena next month." His voice hardened. "They're part of a larger gang that's been terrorizing ranches across the territory. The ringleaders are still out there." Jane's fingers stilled on the buttons. "Will they come after you?" "For revenge." The concern in her voice seemed to touch something in Colton. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his chest. "I can take care of myself, Jane," he said softly. "And my ranch." The warmth of his hand, the intimate use of her given name, the intensity in his blue eyes. It was all suddenly too much. Jane stepped back, breaking the contact. Of course, she said, her voice not quite steady. I should go? Let you rest. Colton stood, towering over her in the small room. Thank you for coming to check on me. It means a lot. Jane nodded, unable to trust her voice. She turned to leave, but his next words stopped her. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow evening? Just the two of us. She turned back, searching his face. Are you asking to court me, Mr. Reeves? A smile touched his lips. I thought we'd agreed on Colton. And yes, I suppose I am. Jane knew she should refuse. She had come to Montana to build an independent life, not to fall into another man's orbit. Yet something about Colton Reeves called to her in a way no man ever had. His straightforward honesty, his quiet strength, his respect for her independence even as he offered his support. I would like that, she heard herself say. Dinner tomorrow. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm, bright, and full of promise. I'll call for you at 6. As Jane walked back to her boarding house, her emotions were in turmoil. She was drawn to Colton, powerfully, undeniably drawn to him. But her past experiences made her wary. In Philadelphia, she had learned the hard way that a man's affections could turn possessive, controlling. Her fiancé had seemed kind and supportive until she expressed opinions that differed from his, until she insisted on teaching rather than becoming merely a society wife. Would Colton prove different? Or would he, too, expect her to set aside her ambitions once his interest became serious? Jane didn't know, but as she prepared for bed that night, she realized she wanted to find out. Montana had already given her a fresh start, a purpose, a community that valued her skills. Perhaps it might also give her something she had stopped believing in, a love based on mutual respect rather than expectation and control. The following evening, Jane dressed with particular care in her best dress, a deep blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes. It was one of the few fine things she had kept from her previous life, saved for special occasions. Precisely at 6, Colton arrived at the boarding house. Despite his injury, he looked handsome in a tailored suit that Jane suspected he rarely wore. His left arm remained in a sling, but color had returned to his face, and his eyes brightened noticeably when he saw her. You look beautiful, he said simply. Thank you. Jane accepted the compliment with a smile. You clean up rather well yourself, considering you were shot 3 days ago. Colton laughed. I'm harder to kill than a mountain pine. He offered his good arm. Shall we? I've reserved a table at the hotel restaurant. The Elk Valley Hotel's restaurant was the finest establishment in town, which, admittedly, wasn't saying much by Philadelphia standards. But the tables were covered with clean cloths, the silverware polished, and the food several steps above typical frontier fare. As they settled at a corner table, Jane was acutely aware of the glances directed their way from other diners. Clearly, her dinner with the territory's most eligible bachelor was causing a stir. I hope you don't mind being the subject of town gossip, Colton said, seemingly reading her thoughts. In a place this size, 2 people can't share a meal without everyone speculating about wedding dates. Jane laughed. I've endured worse gossip. As soon as the words left her mouth, she wished she could recall them. Colton's expression turned curious. In Philadelphia? He asked quietly. Jane hesitated, then decided that if they were to explore whatever was growing between them, honesty was essential. Yes, it's why I came west, actually. Colton waited, not pushing, but his eyes encouraged her to continue. I was engaged, Jane began, her fingers tracing the pattern on the tablecloth, to the son of one of Philadelphia's most prominent families. Edward seemed everything I could want, educated, cultured, supportive of my desire to teach. At least, he said he was supportive. She paused as the waiter arrived with their soup. When he departed, she continued. As the wedding approached, Edward began to change. Or perhaps he simply stopped hiding his true nature. He expected me to give up my teaching position after we married. When I refused, he became controlling, monitoring my friends, my activities, even the books I read. Colton's expression darkened. Sounds like a man who prefers ownership to partnership. Precisely, Jane agreed, surprised and touched by his immediate understanding. The final straw came when I discovered he had written to the school board, without my knowledge, informing them that I would be resigning at the end of the term. When I confronted him, he saw nothing wrong with his actions, said it was a husband's right to make such decisions. I'm guessing you disagreed, Colton said with a small smile. Vehemently. Jane returned his smile briefly before her expression sobered. I broke our engagement that night. Edward was not pleased. He spread rumors about me, implied there were reasons beyond our incompatibility for the broken engagement. Scandalous reasons. Were there? Colton asked directly. No, Jane said firmly. But in society circles, a woman's reputation is fragile. Once questioned, it's nearly impossible to restore. Teaching positions that had been open to me suddenly weren't. Former friends crossed the street to avoid me. She took a sip of water. So when I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Montana Territory, it seemed like divine intervention. Their loss is definitely our gain, Colton said with quiet sincerity. Jane studied his face, finding no judgment, only understanding. Thank you for that. And for listening. Thank you for trusting me with your story. Colton hesitated, then added, I want you to know that I respect your independence, Jane. Your dedication to teaching, to your students. I would never ask you to be less than who you are. The simple statement touched Jane deeply. That means a great deal to me. The remainder of the dinner passed pleasantly, their conversation moving to lighter topics. Jane's students, Colton's plans for expanding the ranch's breeding program, books they had both enjoyed. By the time they finished dessert, Jane felt as if she had known Colton for years rather than days. As they walked back to the boarding house, Colton offered his arm, and Jane took it without hesitation. The evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, the sky above them a canopy of stars more brilliant than any Jane had seen in the city. I never tire of this view, Colton said, following her gaze upward. Makes a man feel small and significant all at once, somehow. Small because we're just specks beneath such vastness, Jane mused, and significant because we're capable of appreciating it. Colton looked at her with something like wonder. Exactly that. They reached the boarding house steps too soon. Jane turned to face him, reluctant for the evening to end. Thank you for dinner, she said softly. Thank you for accepting. Colton's voice was equally soft. I'd like to see you again, Jane. Not just for dinner or Sunday visits, but regularly. If that's something you might want as well. Jane took a deep breath. I would like that. Very much. But you're concerned about what that might mean for your position here, Colton finished for her. For the independence you've worked so hard to establish. Again, his perception surprised her. Yes. Colton took her hand in his. I understand. And I want you to know that I admire the strength it took for you to come here alone, to build a new life. I would never want to diminish that. He squeezed her fingers gently. Whatever grows between us, if something does, it should add to your life, not take away from it. His words were exactly what Jane needed to hear, though she hadn't realized it until that moment. You're not what I expected, Colton Reeves. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? He asked with a small smile. Decidedly good. Jane returned his smile. And yes, I would like to see you regularly. The pleasure that lit his face was unmistakable. For a moment, Jane thought he might kiss her, and she was surprised to realize how much she wanted him to. Instead, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Jane Jessup, he said, his voice deeper than usual. I'll call on you again soon. Good night, Colton, she replied, reluctant to reclaim her hand from his warm grasp. As she watched him walk away, Jane acknowledged to herself that she was falling for Colton Reeves, falling faster and harder than she had thought possible after her experience in Philadelphia. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. What she didn't know was that the peaceful evening they had shared marked the beginning of a courtship that would test them both in ways neither could anticipate. For the rustlers Colton had helped capture were indeed part of a larger gang, and their leaders were not men who forgave those who interfered with their operations. Even now, they were plotting revenge against the rancher who had cost them men and cattle, revenge that would soon threaten everything Jane and Colton were beginning to build together. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Jane's life. Her teaching duties brought daily satisfaction as her students responded to her methods, making steady progress in their studies. The entire community seemed to have embraced her, from the mothers who sent special treats for her lunch to the fathers who tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her on the street. And then there was Colton. True to his word, he called on her regularly, sometimes for dinner at the hotel, sometimes for rides in his buggy to explore the countryside around Elk Valley. On Sundays, they attended church together, followed by dinner at the ranch with Elena, who made no effort to hide her approval of their growing relationship. As October painted the landscape in brilliant golds and reds, Jane found herself falling deeper in love with both Montana and the man who had come to dominate her thoughts. Colton was everything Edward had not been, respectful of her independence, genuinely interested in her opinions, and supportive of her teaching career. One crisp Saturday afternoon, they rode to a scenic overlook above the valley. Colton spread a blanket on a flat boulder, and they enjoyed a picnic lunch prepared by Elena. "I have something for you," Colton said as they finished the meal, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Colton, you shouldn't. It's nothing extravagant," he assured her, producing a small leather-bound book. "I noticed you writing in your journal most evenings. Thought you might like a new one." Jane accepted the gift, touched by his thoughtfulness. The leather was butter-soft, the pages thick and creamy. "It's beautiful. Thank you. I had it ordered from Helena," Colton admitted. "Wanted to get you something special." Jane ran her fingers over the cover, then looked up at him. "It's perfect." Something in her voice or expression must have affected Colton deeply. He moved closer on the blanket, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Jane," he said softly, "I know it hasn't been long, but I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you." Her heart hammered in her chest. "Nor I about you. May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Jane leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, but quickly deepened as months of growing attraction finally found expression. Jane's arms wound around Colton's neck as his hands slid into her hair, loosening pins until several strands escaped their confines. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Colton rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I've been wanting to do that since the day you stepped down from the stagecoach," he confessed. Jane laughed softly. "I was covered in dust and half-starved that day. And the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen," Colton insisted, opening his eyes to gaze at her. "Still are." They shared several more kisses before the cooling afternoon air reminded them of the approaching evening. As they packed up the remains of their picnic, Jane couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come from the desperate young woman who had arrived in Whitehorn with nothing but hope and a few coins in her pockets. Now she had a position she loved, a community that respected her, and a man who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. It seemed almost too good to be true. Perhaps it was that thought, that flash of doubt, that sent a shiver down Jane's spine as they rode back toward town. Or perhaps it was simply the October wind picking up as the sun began its descent. Either way, the sense of foreboding that briefly touched Jane proved unfortunately prophetic. For as they approached the outskirts of Elk Valley, a rider galloped toward them at breakneck speed. It was one of Colton's ranch hands, his face tense with urgency. "Mr. Reeves," the man called, reining his horse to a hard stop beside their buggy. "The north pasture's on fire," looking like it was set deliberate-like. Colton's expression hardened instantly. "How bad?" "Spreading fast with the wind. Boys are trying to get the cattle moved, but it's chaos. Flames on 3 sides already. I'll be right there." Colton turned to Jane, conflict evident in his eyes. "Jane, go," she said immediately. "I can drive myself back to town." He hesitated only briefly before handing her the reins. "Be careful. I'll come find you as soon as I can." With that, he was swinging up behind his ranch hand, and the two men galloped away, leaving Jane to drive the buggy back to town alone. As she watched them disappear over a rise, that sense of foreboding returned, stronger now. Jane wasn't a superstitious woman, but in that moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that the happiness of the past weeks was about to be severely tested. By the time Jane reached the boarding house, word of the fire had already spread through town. Several men were organizing water wagons and volunteers to help fight the blaze if it threatened to move toward Elk Valley. Jane longed to ride out to the Double C to offer assistance, but knew she would likely be more hindrance than help. Instead, she paced her room, alternately praying and peering out the window toward the northern horizon, where an ominous orange glow now tinted the evening sky. It was nearly midnight when a knock came at her door. Jane opened it to find Elena, her face smudged with soot, her eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. "The fire is contained," the older woman said without preamble. "But the damage." She shook her head. "Colton, Jane asked, fear tightening her throat. He is well. Exhausted, fighting the flames himself alongside the men. Elena sank into the room's only chair. But we lost nearly 100 head of cattle, and the north pasture is destroyed. It will be months before the grass grows back. Thank God no one was hurt, Jane said, relief making her knees weak. Elena's expression darkened. This time. But this was no accident, Jane. The fire was set in 3 places, with coal oil to ensure it would spread quickly. This was deliberate, malicious. The rustlers? Revenge for Colton helping capture their men. We think so. The sheriff has ridden out to investigate. Elena sighed heavily. This is not the end of their vengeance, I fear. The prediction proved accurate. Over the next 2 weeks, a series of escalating incidents plagued the Double C Ranch. Fences cut, a well poisoned, threatening notes nailed to fence posts. The sheriff and his deputies increased patrols, but the territory was vast, and the perpetrators seemed to know the land as well as Colton did. Colton himself grew increasingly grim, the light-hearted moments of their courtship replaced by preoccupation and worry. Still, he made time to see Jane several times a week, though their conversations inevitably turned to the troubles at the ranch. You should hire more men, Jane suggested one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. Extra guards. Already have, Colton replied, rubbing a hand over his face. But I can't keep this up indefinitely. The expense alone would bankrupt most ranches within months. Perhaps if you spoke to the other ranchers, formed some kind of alliance for mutual protection? Colton nodded. We're meeting tomorrow at the Cattlemen's Association. Several others have reported similar incidents, though none as severe as ours. Jane placed her hand over his. Be careful, Colton. These men have shown they're willing to destroy property. I fear they won't hesitate to harm people if confronted directly. I know. He turned his hand to clasp hers. But I can't let them drive me off my land, Jane. The Double C isn't just a ranch to me. It's my father's legacy, my life's work. The intensity in his voice moved her deeply. I understand. Just don't take unnecessary risks. Later that night, as Jane prepared for bed, she heard a commotion in the street below her window. Looking out, she saw several riders galloping into town, headed for the sheriff's office. One of them, she realized with a jolt, was Colton. Without bothering to change from her nightgown, Jane threw on a robe and hurried downstairs. Mrs. Holloway was already at the front door, peering out anxiously. What's happening? Jane asked. Not sure, the landlady replied. But it looks serious. Those men rode in like the devil himself was chasing them. Jane stepped onto the porch, straining to see the activity at the sheriff's office down the street. More men were gathering there now, some armed with rifles and shotguns. Suddenly, Elena appeared, hurrying toward the boarding house. Jane, she called. You must come quickly. Colton needs you. Heart pounding, Jane rushed to meet her. What's happened? The rustlers sent a message, Elena said, her voice tight with anger and fear. They left something at the ranch for Colton to find. What? What did they leave? A doll, made to look like you, with a noose around its neck. Elena's eyes were wide with fear. And a note saying you would be next if Colton didn't leave Montana Territory within 3 days. Cold dread washed over Jane. They're threatening me to get to him. See, Colton is. I have never seen him so angry. So afraid. Elena took Jane's arm. He wants you to come to the sheriff's office. Says he needs to know you're safe. Jane hurried back inside to dress, her mind racing. The rustlers had apparently decided that attacking Colton's property wasn't effective enough. Now they were targeting what they perceived as his greatest vulnerability. Her. When Jane entered the sheriff's office 10 minutes later, the room fell silent. Colton was standing by the sheriff's desk, his face drawn with worry. The moment he saw her, he crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. Thank God, he murmured against her hair. I've been going out of my mind. Jane returned his embrace, aware of the other men watching but not caring. I'm fine, Colton. Truly. He released her reluctantly, keeping one arm around her waist as he turned to face the sheriff and the assembled ranchers. Sheriff Taylor knows the situation. We believe the Blackwater gang is behind the attacks on my ranch and the threats against Miss Jessup. The Blackwater gang? Jane looked up at him, confused. I thought you captured the rustlers weeks ago. Those were just foot soldiers, the sheriff explained, a weathered man with a graying mustache and tired eyes. The real leaders are still at large, 3 brothers named Harris. They've been terrorizing ranches from Wyoming to Montana for years. And now they've made it personal, Colton added grimly. What do they want? Jane asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. For me to abandon the Double C, Colton confirmed. They've had their eyes on my water rights for some time. My land controls access to 3 major streams that feed the northern valley. One of the other ranchers spoke up, a burly man with a thick beard. They've been trying to consolidate control of the water in this region. Most of us have refused to sell, but they've managed to intimidate some smaller operations into leaving. And now they're using me to pressure Colton, Jane said, the full implications becoming clear. They think threatening me will make him abandon everything he's built. Colton's arm tightened around her waist. I won't let them harm you, Jane. I swear it. What are you planning to do? She asked, searching his face. A look passed between Colton and the sheriff that sent a chill down Jane's spine. We're organizing a posse, Sheriff Taylor said. Going after the Blackwater gang directly. We've received intelligence on their hideout in the North Mountains. When? Jane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dawn. Colton replied, his expression resolute. We can't wait for them to make good on their threats. Fear clutched at Jane's heart. A confrontation with hardened criminals, men who had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy and threaten, it could easily turn deadly. There must be another way, she said, looking around at the grim faces of the men. Perhaps the territorial governor could send troops, or, that would take weeks, Miss Jessup, the sheriff interrupted gently. These men have shown they won't wait that long. And I won't risk your safety, Colton added, his voice brooking no argument. Not for one more day. Jane wanted to protest further, to beg Colton not to put himself in danger for her sake. But she recognized the determination in his eyes, the same strength of will that had enabled him to build his ranch from nothing. Then I'll stay at the Double C tonight, she said decisively. With Elena. It's more defensible than the boarding house, and I won't put Mrs. Holloway and her other boarders at risk. Colton hesitated, clearly torn between keeping her close and concern for her safety. The ranch house is solid stone and logs, one of the other men pointed out, and we can leave some men to guard it while we're gone. 4 of my best hands will remain behind, another rancher offered. Finally, Colton nodded. All right, but you stay inside, behind locked doors, until we return. Promise me, Jane. I promise, she said solemnly, though inwardly, she was already formulating plans of her own. Jane had no intention of sitting passively by while Colton and the others risked their lives, partly on her behalf. As the meeting continued, tactics and logistics being discussed, Jane observed the men around her, ranchers and cowhands, the sheriff and his deputies, all preparing to face a dangerous enemy together. This was the true spirit of the frontier, she realized, not the rugged individualism celebrated in dime novels, but a community united against a common threat. And in that moment, despite her fear for Colton and the others, Jane felt a fierce pride in her adopted home and a determination to defend it as fiercely as they would. What none of them realized was that the Blackwater gang had spies in Elk Valley itself. Eyes and ears that were even now reporting on the gathering at the sheriff's office, the plans being made, the posse being organized. The confrontation that awaited at dawn would not be the surprise attack they hoped for, but a carefully planned ambush that would test the courage and resolve of every man involved, and the woman who loved one of them. The Double C Ranch house was eerily quiet that night, with most of the hands joining the posse or positioned as lookouts around the property. Only Elena, Jane, and 2 ranch hands remained inside the solid stone and log structure. Colton had spent a tense hour reviewing security measures before rejoining the men gathering in town. His parting words to Jane had been both a plea and a command: stay inside. No matter what happens, what you hear, promise me you'll stay inside with the doors barred. Now, as midnight approached, Jane sat at the kitchen table with Elena, both women too anxious to sleep. A pot of coffee steamed between them, cups long since gone cold as they strained to hear any sound from outside. He has faced dangerous men before, Elena said, breaking a long silence. Colton knows how to handle himself. Jane nodded, trying to take comfort in the words. Tell me about him, Elena, about the boy he was before he became the man I know. Elena's expression softened with memory. Ah, such a serious child. Always with his father, learning the ranch, working twice as hard as men grown. But there was joy in him, too. In the way he would race his horse across the valley, or spend hours watching new calves find their legs. She smiled. His father worried he would never find time for a wife and family, that the ranch would be his only love. And what did you think? Jane asked. I knew he was waiting. Not consciously, perhaps, but waiting nonetheless, for someone who would understand his devotion to this land, who would see it as he does. Elena reached across the table to grasp Jane's hand. Someone like you. Jane felt tears prick her eyes. I'm afraid, Elena. Not just of what might happen tomorrow, but of what this life would mean. Constant danger, uncertainty. Life is uncertain everywhere. Mihija, Elena said gently. In the fine houses of Philadelphia as much as on the Montana frontier. The question is where your heart finds its home. Before Jane could respond, a sharp crack echoed from outside. A rifle shot, followed quickly by another. Both women froze, eyes locked on each other. One of the ranch hands burst into the kitchen, rifle in hand. Miss Jessup, Mrs. Diaz, into the root cellar now? We're under attack. More shots rang out, closer now. The sound of galloping hooves and men shouting carried clearly through the night air. The posse? Jane asked, even as Elena grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the trapdoor that led to the cellar beneath the kitchen. No, ma'am, the ranch hand replied grimly. These are coming from the wrong direction. Must be the Blackwater gang, or some of them, at least. As Elena lifted the trapdoor, Jane hesitated. What about you and Jim? We'll hold them off, the young man said with more confidence than his pale face suggested. Just stay hidden until Mr. Reeves returns. Jane descended the ladder into the cool darkness of the root cellar, Elena following close behind. The ranch hand closed the trapdoor above them, and Jane heard the scrape of something heavy being dragged across it. Additional protection to keep the cellar hidden. Elena fumbled in the darkness until she found a lantern and matches. The small flame illuminated their refuge, a space about 10 feet square, with shelves of preserved foods along one wall and barrels of apples and potatoes along another. What do we do now? Jane whispered, though there was little chance of being heard over the increasing gunfire outside. Elena's face was resolute in the lantern light. We pray, and we wait. She reached into a barrel near the ladder and withdrew a shotgun. And if necessary, we defend ourselves. Jane stared at the weapon, then at the determination in Elena's eyes. This was the reality of frontier life. Not just the breathtaking vistas and the freedom, but the constant readiness to fight for survival. Teach me how to use it, Jane said firmly. For the next hour, as the sounds of battle ebbed and flowed above them, Elena gave Jane a crash course in loading and firing the shotgun. Jane's hands trembled at first, but gradually steadied as she repeated the motions Elena demonstrated. Suddenly, a heavy impact shook the ceiling above them, followed by an ominous silence. Jane and Elena exchanged alarmed glances. No more gunfire, no shouting, just silence. What happened? Jane whispered. I don't know, Elena replied, her knuckles white around the shotgun. Minutes ticked by, each seeming longer than the last. Then came a new sound, footsteps moving across the kitchen floor above them. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly over the trapdoor. Jane raised the shotgun, aiming at the ceiling as Elena had taught her. Elena positioned herself behind Jane, ready to reload if necessary. The object that had been placed over the trapdoor, a cabinet, Jane guessed, scraped across the floor as it was moved aside. Both women held their breath as the trapdoor began to rise. Jane, Elena, Colton's voice, strained but unmistakable, called down to them. Colton. Jane nearly dropped the shotgun in relief. We're here. We're safe. The trapdoor swung fully open, revealing Colton's face, streaked with dirt and what looked horribly like blood. Thank God, he breathed, extending his hand to help them up. When I saw the gunfire from town, I thought. He broke off, unable to finish the thought. Jane climbed the ladder quickly, Elena following. The kitchen showed signs of the battle, broken windows, a few bullet holes in the walls, chairs overturned. But it was the main room that bore the brunt of the damage. Furniture was splintered, the large front window shattered completely. 2 bodies lay covered with blankets near the fireplace. Jim? Thomas? Jane asked, fearing the worst for the young ranch hands. They'll live, Colton assured her. Both wounded, but not critically. Doc Farley's tending to them in the bunkhouse. And the attackers? Elena asked. Colton's expression hardened. 2 dead, 1 wounded and captured. 3 escaped. The Harris brothers? Jane guessed. No, these were hired guns, not the leaders. Colton ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. The brothers weren't at their hideout either. Someone warned them we were coming. A spy in town, Elena said, her voice tight with anger. Someone betrayed you. Looks that way. Colton turned to Jane, his eyes scanning her as if reassuring himself she was truly unharmed. Are you all right? Really? I'm fine, Jane assured him, stepping closer to lay a hand on his cheek. But you're hurt. Colton covered her hand with his. Just a graze. Nothing serious. Elena muttered something that sounded suspiciously like stubborn men as she moved toward the stove. I will make coffee. You both need it. As Elena busied herself with the coffee, Colton led Jane to a relatively undamaged corner of the main room. The sheriff's organizing search parties for the Harris brothers, he explained quietly. We think they may have crossed into Wyoming territory already. And if they have, Jane asked, what then? Then we alert the authorities there. This doesn't end until they're captured or... He didn't finish the sentence, but Jane understood the implication. In frontier justice, not all outlaws live to stand trial. What about us? Jane asked, the question encompassing far more than just their immediate safety. Colton seemed to understand her meaning. He took both her hands in his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. Jane, these past hours, thinking you might be in danger, that I might lose you before I even truly had you. He shook his head, emotion making his voice rough. It made some things very clear to me. Jane's heart hammered in her chest. What things? That I love you. That I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. Colton's blue eyes held her steadily. I know this isn't the romantic proposal you deserve. God knows I had plans for something more fitting. But I don't want to wait anymore, not with the future so uncertain. He released her hands only to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, a delicate gold band set with a single perfect diamond that caught the lamplight and scattered it in tiny rainbows across Jane's face. It was my mother's, Colton said softly. My father gave it to me before he died, said I should save it for the woman who captured my heart as completely as my mother had captured his. He took a deep breath. Jane Jessup, will you marry me? Time seemed to suspend as Jane looked at the ring, at Colton's face so full of love and hope, at the damaged room around them that represented both the dangers and the beauty of the life he was offering her. 6 months ago, she had arrived in Montana territory with nothing but hope in her pockets, fleeing a man who had tried to control and diminish her. Now she was being offered a future by a man who had consistently supported and elevated her, who had never once asked her to be less than who she was. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain despite the tears welling in her eyes. Yes, Colton Reeves, I will marry you. Joy transformed Colton's face, erasing the fatigue and worry of the past hours. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her, then pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally broke apart, they found Elena watching from the kitchen doorway, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Finally, she said, smiling through her tears, my Colton has found his heart's match. The weeks that followed were a strange blend of joy and vigilance. The Double C Ranch was repaired and fortified, with additional hands hired for security. Jane continued teaching, though now with an armed escort to and from the schoolhouse each day, an arrangement she protested as excessive until Colton pointed out that until all 3 Harris brothers were captured, the threat remained. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the town and surrounding ranches, bringing a flood of well-wishes and gifts. Even Mrs. Holloway, who professed to be heartbroken at losing her favorite boarder, was delighted by the match. I knew from the moment he brought you to town that you were meant for each other, she declared, conveniently forgetting her earlier warnings about focusing on Jane's career rather than marriage prospects. The wedding was set for Christmas Day, less than 2 months away, but Jane saw no reason to wait, especially with the continuing uncertainty surrounding the Blackwater gang. The Harris brothers had seemingly vanished, with reports placing them as far away as Colorado. Some hoped they had abandoned their vendetta against Colton and the Double C, but few believed it. Men like that don't just let go of a grudge, Sheriff Taylor warned during one of his regular visits to the ranch. Stay vigilant, both of you. Despite the lingering threat, Jane found herself happier than she had ever been. She divided her time between teaching, planning the wedding, and learning about ranch operations from Colton and Elena. To her surprise, she found the latter fascinating. The complex balance of breeding programs, grazing rotations, and market considerations that went into running a successful cattle operation. You have a head for business, Colton observed one evening as they reviewed the ranch's books together in the study. Better than mine, I suspect. Jane smiled, pleased by his recognition. I've always been good with figures. My father was an accountant. Perhaps I inherited his aptitude. The Double C could benefit from your skills, Colton said, his tone casual, but his eyes watching her carefully. If you were interested in being more than just the rancher's wife. Jane set down her pencil, touched by his offer and the understanding behind it. I would like that very much. Though I don't intend to give up teaching, at least not immediately. I wouldn't expect you to, Colton assured her. Your students need you as much as the ranch does. It was moments like these that confirmed for Jane that she had made the right decision, that Colton truly did respect her abilities and independence, that marriage to him would be a partnership rather than a surrender of her identity. As December arrived, bringing the first heavy snows of winter, preparations for the wedding intensified. The entire town seemed involved, from the sewing circle creating Jane's wedding dress to the men renovating the small cabin near the main house that would serve as their private residence until spring, when Colton planned to begin construction on a larger home for their future family. 2 weeks before Christmas, Jane was at the schoolhouse late, decorating for the holiday pageant with the help of several older students, when she heard horses approaching. Looking out the window, she expected to see Colton or one of the ranch hands who usually escorted her home. Instead, she saw 3 unfamiliar riders, their faces obscured by scarves against the cold, their horses blowing steam in the winter air. A prickle of alarm ran down Jane's spine. Mary, she said calmly to Samuel Wilson's daughter, take the younger children and go out the back door. Go straight to your father's store and tell him to fetch the sheriff. Quickly now. Mary's eyes widened with understanding. At 13, she was old enough to recognize the tension in Jane's voice. Yes, Miss Jessup, she replied, already gathering the smaller children. Jane moved to the teacher's desk, where she kept the small derringer Colton had insisted she carry. She slipped it into her pocket just as the schoolhouse door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a tall man in a heavy coat. Miss Jessup, he asked, his voice carrying a southern drawl she hadn't heard in Montana before. Or should I say, the future Mrs. Reeves? Who's asking? Jane countered, her hand in her pocket gripping the derringer. The man pulled down his scarf, revealing a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes and the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. Name's Emmett Harris. I believe your fiancé has been looking for me and my brothers. Jane's blood ran cold. Emmett Harris, the eldest and most dangerous of the Blackwater Gang's leaders, standing in her schoolhouse as casually as any parent might. Behind him, his 2 companions had entered as well, positioning themselves near the windows where they could watch the street. The children have nothing to do with your quarrel, Jane said steadily. Let them leave. Emmett glanced at the remaining students, 3 boys around 15 who had stayed behind when the younger children left. Go on, boys. Miss Jessup and I have private matters to discuss. The boys looked to Jane, clearly reluctant to leave her alone with the strangers. She nodded slightly, silently urging them to go. Relief washed over her as they filed out, knowing that between them and Mary, help would soon be on the way. So I've noticed. Emmett moved closer, his gaze assessing her in a way that made Jane's skin crawl. Which is why I've come to make a different kind of proposal. One that benefits us both. I can't imagine what proposal you could make that I would find beneficial, Jane said, her hand tightening around the derringer in her pocket. It's simple. You come with us, nice and quiet. We send a message to Reeves, his woman for his water rights. He signs over the Double C's water access. You go free. Emmett spread his hands. Everyone lives, everyone walks away. Jane's mind raced. She had no doubt that if she went with these men, her chances of survival were slim to none, regardless of whether Colton complied with their demands. But she needed to stall for time, to give help a chance to arrive. "And if I refuse to go with you?" she asked, taking a step sideways, putting the heavy teacher's desk between them. Emmett's expression hardened. "Then things get considerably less pleasant, Miss Jessup. For you, for Reeves, for anyone who gets in our way." He nodded to one of his men. "Check outside. Make sure those boys aren't bringing trouble." As one of the men moved to the window, Jane seized her chance. In one fluid motion, she drew the derringer from her pocket and aimed it squarely at Emmett Harris. "I think you should leave," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Now." Emmett looked at the small gun, then at Jane's face, and laughed. "You think you can stop all three of us with that little pea shooter?" "No," came a new voice from the back of the room. "But we can." Jane didn't dare take her eyes off Emmett, but she recognized Colton's voice instantly. Relief flooded through her as Emmett's expression changed to one of wary calculation. "Reeves," he acknowledged. "Figured you'd show up eventually." "Step away from her, Harris," Colton commanded. Jane could hear the barely controlled fury in his voice. "You and your brothers are surrounded. The sheriff and his men are outside." Emmett's eyes narrowed. "Always did have good timing, Reeves. But this isn't over, not by a long shot." "It's over today," Colton replied. "Now move away from Miss Jessup, or I'll put a bullet in you where you stand." For a tense moment, Jane thought Emmett might risk it, might draw on Colton despite the odds. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his hands. "All right, Reeves. You win this round." His cold eyes fixed on Jane. "Pleasure making your acquaintance, Miss Jessup. Shame we couldn't come to an arrangement." Sheriff Taylor and his deputies burst in through the front door at the same moment Colton and two ranch hands advanced from the back. Within minutes, all three Harris brothers were disarmed and in custody, their expressions promising vengeance despite their surrender. As soon as the outlaws were led away, Colton crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled Jane into his arms. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, holding her at arm's length to examine her. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her hands were shaking now that the danger had passed. "How did you know?" "Mary and the boys ran into the ranch hands coming to escort you home," Colton explained, pulling her close again. "Thank God they got to us in time." Jane rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Not just for myself, but for what they might do to you." Colton's arms tightened around her. "It's over now. The Harris brothers will stand trial in Helena, and with the evidence against them, they'll hang or spend the rest of their lives in prison." "You really think it's over?" Jane asked, pulling back to search his face. "I do," Colton said with quiet certainty. "The rest of their gang has scattered or been captured, and with the Cattlemen's Association united against them, no one will be taking their place anytime soon." Relief washed over Jane, followed by a bone-deep exhaustion as the fear and tension of the past weeks finally began to dissipate. "Take me home, Colton," she whispered. "With pleasure," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And in 10 days, it will be your home too, permanently." Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the snow-covered landscape glittering like diamonds under the morning sun. In Mrs. Holloway's largest guest room, Jane stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The wedding dress, created with loving care by the women of Elk Valley, was a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate lace. Her hair was arranged in an elegant knot, adorned with a crown of winter roses and evergreen sprigs. Around her neck hung a gold locket, Colton's wedding gift, delivered that morning with a note that had brought tears to her eyes. "For the woman who arrived with only hope in her pockets and gave me everything in return." A knock at the door preceded Elena's entrance. The older woman stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Jane," she breathed. "You are beautiful. Like an angel." Jane smiled, emotion tightening her throat. "Thank you, Elena. For everything. For welcoming me. For helping create this day." Elena crossed the room to adjust the veil that cascaded down Jane's back. "It has been my joy to see Colton find happiness with you, and to gain a daughter in the process." She squeezed Jane's hands. "Are you ready? The church is full to bursting. I think the entire territory has come to see you married." Jane took a deep breath, centering herself in the moment. 6 months ago, she had stepped off the stagecoach in Whitehorn, a desperate woman with nothing but determination and the last of her funds. Now she was about to marry a man who loved her completely, surrounded by a community that had embraced her as one of their own. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady with certainty. The small church was indeed full, its simple interior transformed by evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and dozens of candles. As Jane moved down the aisle on Samuel Wilson's arm, the closest thing to a father figure she had in Elk Valley, she saw familiar faces everywhere, her students and their parents, fellow teachers from neighboring towns, ranchers and their families, shopkeepers and cowboys alike. And at the altar, waiting with barely contained joy, stood Colton. The moment their eyes met, everything else faded away: the crowded church, the whispered admiration, the music from the small organ. There was only Colton, his blue eyes shining with love and promise. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. Jane would later remember fragments: the warmth of Colton's hands holding hers, the slight tremor in his voice as he recited his vows, the cool slide of the gold band onto her finger, the minister's triumphant pronouncement of their union. And then Colton was kissing her, his lips gentle yet possessive, sealing their vows in the most ancient way. The celebration that followed at the Double C Ranch lasted well into the night. The main house and barn had been decorated for the occasion, tables groaning with food prepared by Elena and the other ranch wives. Fiddle music filled the air as couples danced on the wooden floor laid specially in the barn. Children darted between adults, high on excitement and stolen sweets. As the evening progressed, Jane found herself on the wide porch of the main house, taking a moment's respite from the festivities. Colton joined her, wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders against the December chill. "Happy, Mrs. Reeves?" he asked, his arms sliding around her waist. The name, her new name, still sent a thrill through her. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I think I'll still be Miss Jessup at the schoolhouse." Colton chuckled. "Whatever you prefer. You know I'm already the envy of every man in the territory, having a wife who's both beautiful and educated." Jane turned in his arms to face him. "And I'm the envy of every woman, having a husband who values both qualities equally." Colton's expression grew serious. "I meant what I said in my vows, Jane. I will always support your dreams, your ambitions. The teaching, the ranch accounts, whatever gives you purpose." "I know," Jane said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "That's why I love you." Their kiss was interrupted by Elena calling from the doorway. "The guests are asking for the bride and groom. The final dance is about to begin." Hand in hand, they returned to the celebration, to the warmth and light and music that symbolized the life they would build together. A life neither had expected when Jane stepped off that stagecoach 6 months earlier, with nothing but hope in her pockets and determination in her heart. Years later, when the Double C had grown to become one of the largest and most prosperous ranches in Montana, when their children ran laughing through the same fields where Jane and Colton had first ridden together, the story of how they met became a favorite family tale. How a schoolteacher from Philadelphia had arrived with only hope, and how a rancher with land and cattle aplenty had found in her the one thing all his wealth couldn't buy, a love that made him truly rich. And on quiet evenings, as they sat together on the porch of the grand house they had eventually built, watching the sun set over the land they both loved, Jane would sometimes touch the locket that never left her throat and whisper, "You gave me everything too." To which Colton would invariably reply, with the same certainty that had carried them through decades together, "Best trade I ever made."